All I wanted were 3-inch galvanized screws, but when the bigoted owner refused me service, I decided to buy his entire hardware store. I quickly learned that some secrets, far darker than any prejudice, are best left buried. The bell above the door gave its usual tinny, irritating jingle as I walked into the Gilded Nook, my local hardware store. It was a place I'd frequented for years, ever since I moved to this quiet, slightly pretentious suburban town. The air inside always smelled the same, a comforting mix of sawdust, machine oil, and desperation, the desperation of a small business owner fighting the tide of big-box retailers. Mr. Henderson, the owner, was polishing the counter with the intensity of a man trying to buff away his impending bankruptcy. He was a study in faded tweed and simmering resentment, the kind of man whose posture was permanently set to offended. I needed 3-inch galvanized screws and some industrial-strength epoxy. "Morning, Mr. Henderson," I said, keeping my voice friendly. I'm 6'3", built like a linebacker who decided spreadsheets were his true calling, and I know my way around power tools. I've never been mistaken for anyone else, which is usually fine. Today it wasn't. Henderson didn't look up. He just grunted, a sound somewhere between a tired pig and a broken muffler. I waited a moment, leaning against a display of shiny, useless lawn ornaments. "I need those screws, sir. The heavy-duty ones." Finally he lifted his eyes. They were small, watery blue, and they immediately locked onto me, a slow, ugly appraisal that tightened the air in the small shop. The jingle of the door hadn't brought in another customer. It had brought in me. "You," he snapped, dropping the polishing rag onto the counter as if it were contaminated. His voice was sharper than any chisel in the place. "You need to leave." I blinked, genuinely confused. "Excuse me? I've been shopping here for 5 years. Is it closing time already?" I glanced at the clock. 10:15 a.m. "I don't care if you built the bloody foundation of this building," Henderson spat, pushing himself away from the counter and planting his hands firmly on his hips. He stood maybe 5'7", but right then he seemed to inflate with misplaced authority. "This establishment is not for you." The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the buzzing of the fluorescent lights. I felt the blood heat up in my neck. I looked past him, searching for the source of the problem. A hidden sign, a newly installed barrier, anything. There was nothing. Just aisles of hammers and paint cans, and me. "I think you might have me confused with someone else, Mr. Henderson," I managed, trying to keep my tone level. Professional. I needed those screws, damn it. But more than that, I hated being patronized. "Oh, I've got you perfectly sorted in my head, son," he sneered, leaning in conspiratorially, though there was no one else around to hear him. "There are places for certain types, and this ain't it. I've got a specific clientele, and frankly, your presence makes my established customers uncomfortable." I straightened up to my full height. This wasn't just rude. This was blatant, ugly discrimination. In the middle of the day, in a small-town hardware store, my 5 years of patronage, my steady stream of income supporting his failing business, meant absolutely nothing compared to the color of my skin. "Are you seriously telling me to leave your store because I'm black?" My voice echoed off the concrete floor. I felt a strange, cold clarity wash over the initial flush of anger. This wasn't a debate. This was a test. Henderson didn't even flinch. He adjusted his glasses, a gesture of supreme confidence. "I'm telling you to leave because I said so. And if you don't walk out that door under your own steam right now, I'll call the police and have you charged with loitering and trespassing." I took a deep, slow breath. I could argue. I could pull out my phone, record him, and start the fight that would drag on for months in courtrooms and local gossip chains. But right now, standing there, smelling the sawdust and the desperation, a different path crystallized in my mind. A path that was cleaner, faster, and infinitely more satisfying than a lawsuit. I looked him dead in the eye, ignoring the mounting tension in my jaw. "Fine, Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice dangerously soft. I turned slowly, walked to the door, and pushed it open. The bell jingled its irritating farewell. I didn't leave the parking lot. I walked across the cracked asphalt to my car, a late-model luxury sedan that Henderson had probably already judged as stolen, and retrieved my phone. I didn't call the police. I called my lawyer. "David," I said, keeping my voice low and even as I leaned against the driver's side door, "I need you to get downtown immediately. Bring the necessary paperwork. I want to purchase the property at 412 Elm Street. Yes, the Gilded Nook. Cash offer, no contingencies. I want it done before noon." David, who has known me since law school, knew that tone. It was the sound of a man who had just found the perfect chess move after being checkmated in the opening game. "The hardware store, sir? You're serious?" "Deadly serious, David. Draw up the papers. I'll be there with the retainer in 20 minutes. And David," I paused, glancing back at the little shop where I'd just been racially ejected, "get me the name and contact information for Mr. Henderson. I want to know his financial status, his mortgage details, and the name of his bank. Everything." I hung up the phone. The heat of the morning sun felt suddenly insignificant compared to the internal furnace roaring within me. I checked my watch. 10:21 a.m. I spent the next 15 minutes making calls, arranging wire transfers, and leveraging assets that Henderson, polishing his dusty counter, couldn't even dream existed. My net worth, built painstakingly through tech patents and strategic investments over the last decade, was about to be deployed for a singular, satisfying purpose. At 10:45 a.m., I was back in my car, driving slowly back toward the Gilded Nook. David had confirmed. The seller, an elderly cousin of Henderson's who had inherited the building but lived 3 states away, was eager to sell quickly. The initial offer was accepted, pending immediate paperwork completion. I parked directly in front of the entrance, exactly where I'd been told to leave. I walked in. The bell jangled again. Mr. Henderson was still standing behind the counter, wiping down the same spot where he'd dropped his polishing rag. He looked smug, victorious. He saw me, and his face instantly hardened into a mask of hostile expectation. "I told you to leave," he hissed. "Are you back here to start trouble?" I walked up to the counter, placing a thick, embossed manila folder directly in front of him, right next to the price tags for the 3-inch galvanized screws. The folder didn't even have a label. It didn't need one. "No trouble, Mr. Henderson," I said, meeting his gaze. "I'm here to finalize a transaction." He looked down at the folder, then back up at me, suspicion warring with outright rage. "What transaction? You think you can buy a single Phillips head screwdriver now? Get out!" He slammed his hand down on the counter, rattling a display of tape measures. I leaned in close, savoring the moment, the scent of sawdust now mixed with rising panic. "I'm not buying a screwdriver, sir. I'm buying the building. The Gilded Nook, lot 412 Elm, is now mine." Henderson stared at the folder, then at my face, then back at the folder, as if expecting it to suddenly burst into flames and reveal itself as a prank. The color drained from his face with terrifying speed, leaving his skin the shade of old parchment. That's not possible," he stammered, reaching a trembling hand toward the thick paper. He fumbled with the clasp of the folder, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He pulled out the top sheet, the finalized notarized purchase agreement, and his eyes scanned the bolded text where my name, my new ownership name, was clearly printed in heavy ink. "This is a joke," he whispered, but the denial sounded hollow, even to his own ears. "Who are you? You're just some kid." "I'm the new owner, Mr. Henderson," I confirmed, stepping back slightly to give him room to absorb the reality. I allowed a slow, deliberate smile to spread across my face. "As of exactly 10 minutes ago, this entire establishment, land and assets included, belongs to me." His mouth opened and closed several times. The smug defiance that had inflated him moments earlier collapsed like a punctured lung. He was small again, suddenly looking frail beneath the thick tweed. He clutched the document so tightly his knuckles were white bone against his thin skin. "But the mortgage," he managed, his voice cracking. "The bank wouldn't. You can't just buy the deed out from under me this fast. I have tenants in the back storage units. I have inventory loans. I bought it from the actual owner, Mr. Henderson. Your cousin, Agnes," I explained, leaning against an adjacent shelf stocked with paint thinner. She was surprisingly receptive to a large, immediate cash buyout. "Apparently she's been trying to offload this burden for years. You should have paid closer attention to your family dynamics." The realization hit him like a physical blow. He looked around the shop, at the worn wooden floorboards he'd complained about for years, at the familiar dusty smell, at the tools he'd painstakingly collected, and understood that it was all instantly gone. Lost. Not to a corporate takeover, not to bankruptcy, but to the man he had just tried to physically eject from the premises. "You did this," he gasped, his eyes wide and accusatory. "You came in here just to humiliate me." "Humiliation is a byproduct, sir, not the product," I corrected him smoothly. "The product was the screws. But since you refused to sell them to me based on prejudice, I decided to purchase the entire inventory, including the building, at a premium, just to remove the obstacle." He dropped the papers. They fluttered down onto the counter beside the register. Henderson took a staggering step back, his eyes darting wildly around the room as if searching for an escape hatch that didn't involve the front door. "Get out," he croaked, pointing a shaking finger towards the exit. "This is still my store. You can't just—" "Actually, I can," I interrupted, pushing off the shelf. I walked around the counter, moving into his territory. Henderson flinched, shrinking away until his back hit the display rack holding caulking guns. "Effective immediately. You are trespassing on my property," I stated, my voice dropping back to the firm, authoritative tone I used in boardrooms. "You have exactly 5 minutes to gather any personal items, your wallet, your keys, your coat, and leave. Do not touch the inventory. Do not touch the cash register. The initial asset appraisal is already complete, and it factors in all current stock." He stared up at me, his face contorting. It wasn't just anger now, it was sheer existential terror. He had been reduced from the proprietor of his domain to an unwelcome stranger in less than 20 minutes. "This is illegal. I'll sue you. I'll call the police right now," he shrieked, lunging clumsily for the phone mounted near the safe. I was faster. I moved with the calculated speed of someone who anticipated resistance. I reached the wall first and gently, but firmly, disconnected the phone line from the wall jack. The small plastic plug dangled uselessly. "No police, Mr. Henderson. Not yet," I said, holding the dangling cord. "You call them, and you explain why you were trying to assault the new property owner who is offering you the chance to walk away without criminal charges for this morning's altercation. You think you'll get sympathy when they hear, 'Why? You were being asked to leave.'" He sagged against the metal rack. The sound of the fluorescent lights buzzing seemed deafening in the sudden vacuum of his authority. "My life," he whispered, a defeated gargle. "This was my life's work." "It was a failing business, sir." "You were drowning," I said, feeling a strange absence of malice, just cold, efficient execution. "I offered you a way out this morning, and you spat on it. Now, you take the severance I'm offering you, and it's generous, considering the circumstances, and you leave quietly." I nodded toward the door. 4 minutes left. Henderson looked broken. He didn't argue, didn't plead. He seemed to deflate, his tweed jacket suddenly looking 3 sizes too big. He slowly reached up, grabbed his worn leather jacket from the coat rack behind the counter, and then fumbled for his keys. He walked past me, his eyes fixed on the floor, moving like a defeated automaton toward the door. He paused at the threshold, his hand hovering over the push bar. He didn't look back at the shelves, the tools, or the register. He just pushed the door open. The bell jangled one last pathetic time. I stood there, listening to the sound of his aging sedan sputtering to life in the parking lot, then pulling away. Silence descended upon the gilded nook. It was a different silence now, not one of desperate anticipation, but of absolute completion. I walked over to the counter, picked up the scattered documents, and smoothed them out. I was about to retrieve my phone to call David back with final instructions, when a new sound pierced the quiet. Not the gentle jingle of the door, but a heavy, panicked pounding. Bam! 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 It was loud, frantic, and definitely not the sound of a customer coming in for nails. I turned, startled, looking towards the front window. Pressed against the glass, banging desperately on the pane with both fists, was Mr. Henderson. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, looking utterly frantic, stood a woman in a sensible summer dress, gripping a thick envelope, while several other people, neighbors, judging by their familiar faces, were gathering on the sidewalk, pointing at the shop. Henderson's eyes were wild, terrified, locked on mine. He pointed a frantic, shaking finger past me toward the back of the store, screaming something I couldn't hear clearly through the glass. Then I heard it. Not from outside, but from the shadowy recesses of the storage room, a sudden, sickening thud, followed by a heavy, dragging sound like something very large and very dead being pulled across the concrete floor. Henderson's face went from panic to sheer, unadulterated horror. He stopped banging on the glass, his mouth opening in a silent, terrified "Oh!" as he finally collapsed backward onto the pavement, his body going utterly limp. He hadn't fainted from anger or bankruptcy. He'd fainted from something he'd left behind. And I was now standing alone inside the store, the only person present, with the front door locked, and whatever made that dragging sound moving slowly, deliberately, toward the main showroom. The thud and the subsequent drag were too solid, too heavy to be a settling shelf or a dropped piece of hardware. They sounded like an obstacle being painfully repositioned. The silence that followed the sound was worse than the noise itself, a complete, dead vacuum where sound should be. I took an involuntary step back from the counter, my senses on high alert. The initial adrenaline surge from the confrontation with Henderson had evaporated, replaced by a cold, prickling dread crawling up my spine. This was no longer a corporate land grab. This felt like I had walked directly into a trap set by someone else entirely. Outside, the commotion escalated. Henderson lay motionless on the sidewalk. The woman with the envelope was screaming, and the gathering neighbors were now fumbling for their phones, pointing not just at Henderson, but at the front door of my newly acquired property. I ignored them. I couldn't afford to be distracted by the street theater. Whatever was in the back, Henderson's terror was too genuine, too immediate. He hadn't just lost his store. He had been running from something, and in his haste to escape me, he'd forgotten to lock it away properly. I slowly turned toward the swinging door that led to the storage and workshop area, a perpetually dim space crammed with lumber, paint thinners, and the industrial smell that characterized the back end of any good hardware store. The door hung slightly ajar, an invitation into the gloom. "Hello?" I called out, keeping my voice steady despite the frantic thumping of my own heart. "Is anyone back there?" "The store is closed." No verbal reply, but the dragging sound started again, slower this time, punctuated by a low, wet scraping noise. It was coming from behind the towering stack of insulation bales near the rear loading dock. I scanned the counter. My keys were in my pocket. My phone was in my hand, but calling the police now would mean explaining why I had just chased the former owner into a catatonic state, only to immediately hear what sounded like a body being moved inside the locked building. I needed to see. I moved silently toward the swinging door. My size, which had felt intimidating to Henderson, now felt like a liability, a big target in a confined space. I reached the doorway and leaned slightly, peering around the edge. The back room was cavernous and smelled powerfully of mildew and something metallic, like old copper or dried blood. Light was scarce, filtering weakly through grimy, high windows. In the center of the concrete floor, near the heavy steel shelving units, I saw it. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was a massive, dark shape, irregularly contoured and definitely moving under its own volition. It was incredibly low to the ground, almost crawling, yet it possessed a discernible bulk that suggested serious weight. It was dragging itself forward, leaving a slick, dark trail on the dusty concrete floor, the source of the metallic odor. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I realized the shape was obscuring something else. It wasn't dragging itself. It was pulling something large and wrapped in what looked like heavy, oil-stained canvas, possibly a drop cloth or an industrial tarp. The movement was labored, inhumanly slow, but relentless. Then the shape paused, its attention seemingly drawn toward the slight opening of the door where I stood. It didn't have a clear head or limbs in the traditional sense, but I could sense it orienting itself towards me. The dragging stopped. A small, sickening realization hit me regarding Henderson's earlier panic. He hadn't been afraid of me coming in. He had been afraid of me finding out what he'd left behind. Before I could retreat or even register a plan, the shape convulsed violently. and a section of the canvas it was pulling peeled back, revealing something pale and disturbingly smooth underneath. It looked like a human limb, horribly unnaturally positioned. The thing in the back emitted a low, guttural sound, a deep, resonant vibration that resonated in my chest cavity. It wasn't a roar. It was a sound of profound, ancient exhaustion, the sound of something that had been struggling under immense weight for a very long time. And then the thing began to move again. But this time, faster. It wasn't dragging the top anymore. It seemed to be using newly found momentum, surging toward the doorway in a rush of scraping concrete and heavy, wet movement. It was coming for the light, coming for the only open exit. I slammed my body against the door, throwing my weight into it, desperately trying to slam the wooden barrier shut against the rising tide of darkness and whatever grotesque secret Henderson had failed to tidy up before his hasty departure. The wood groaned under the impact, but the force from the back room was monumental. The door shuddered violently, bowing inward just as a heavy, blunt object, something hard and dense, slammed into the exact center of the wood, inches from my face. The impact cracked the door panel, sending splinters flying past my ear. I shoved harder, bracing my feet, pushing against the sheer, desperate strength of whatever was trying to breach the threshold. I could feel the pressure escalating, the frame beginning to splinter under the sustained assault. I was locked in a physical standoff with the hidden horror of the gilded nook, and the world outside, with its screaming neighbors and unconscious former owner, was completely useless. If the door gave way, I wouldn't be facing a disgruntled shopkeeper. I would be facing whatever grim cleanup job Henderson had been hiding from the world. And I had no idea if that thing was alone. My muscles screamed in protest as I threw every ounce of my weight against the warping door. The wood shrieked, a high-pitched sound of surrender that briefly drowned out the commotion outside. The central impact point where the blunt object had struck splintered further, and I caught a glimpse of the attacker's edge. Not metal, not wood, but something chitinous, dark, and disturbingly organic, coated in that thick, reddish-black slime. I couldn't hold it for long. The pressure was relentless. I knew the moment the frame gave way, I would be overwhelmed. Survival instinct kicked in, overriding the shock. I looked wildly around the main showroom, my eyes locked onto the heavy-duty pallet, Jack sitting innocently beside the paint display, a massive steel lever designed to lift thousands of pounds. With a grunt of pure desperation, I released the pressure on the door for a split second, enough to wrench the pallet jack free. Then, turning swiftly, I jammed the steel tongue of the jack diagonally underneath the swinging door frame, using the sturdy counter as a brace. It was a desperate, clumsy maneuver, but it created an immediate, if temporary, mechanical lock, forcing the heavy steel crossbar against the buckling wood. The sudden resistance made the thing in the back recoil slightly, confused by the unexpected counterforce. That was my opening. I didn't look back at the door, knowing the wood wouldn't hold for more than a minute. I ran straight for the front door, ignoring the frantic cries of the woman outside, who was now trying to pull the unconscious Henderson further away from the building. I yanked the front door open and bolted outside, pulling the door shut behind me, but I didn't lock it. I needed the exit open. "Call 911, I roared at the shocked gathering crowd, pointing back at the store. "There is a hazardous situation inside. Fire, gas leak, get back." The vague threat of a recognized public danger, fire, was often more effective than the truth. The crowd, already agitated by Henderson's collapse, scrambled backward, putting significant distance between themselves and the gilded nook. I didn't wait for the sirens. I sprinted to my car, my hands slick with cold sweat. I ripped the door open, grabbed the briefcase containing the finalized contracts, my leverage, and then pulled out the one thing I had grabbed from my trunk earlier, purely on a whim. A heavy-duty, industrial-grade propane torch kit I had intended to buy earlier that morning. I ignited the torch. A focused, brilliant blue-white flame erupted, roaring to life with terrifying intensity. It was the purest form of focused heat, capable of welding steel. I ran back to the front door, kicking it open wide. The moment I stepped inside, the air hit me, thick, suffocating, and smelling overwhelmingly of ammonia and decay. The dragging sound had stopped. The area near the back door was a dark, viscous pool reflecting the fluorescent lights overhead. The canvas-wrapped shape was still there, but it was twitching violently, apparently stunned by the sudden influx of light and air, and perhaps realizing the exit was now open. I didn't hesitate. I aimed the roaring torch directly at the darkest, wettest spot on the floor, near where the shape lay. "This property is condemned," I yelled, a final declaration of my ownership and control. I squeezed the trigger and unleashed the full force of the flame onto the pooled slime. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The liquid ignited with a deafening whoosh, not like gasoline, but with a deep, sickly, biological fire that burned unnaturally hot and emitted clouds of thick, oily black smoke that immediately choked the showroom. The creature in the back reacted with a horrifying, echoing shriek, a sound that defied natural classification, a sound of pure, primal agony. The shape thrashed one last time, sending the heavy canvas tumbling away. What was revealed was far worse than a corpse. It was a dense, bulbous mass of pale, partially desiccated organic matter, riddled with dark, vein-like structures. It looked like something that had been kept alive, or at least dormant, in the cold darkness, wrapped tightly and weighted down, perhaps for years. It was undeniably, sickeningly non-human, a mass of putrefied tissue that had clearly required significant effort to move. Henderson hadn't been selling hardware. He'd been running a highly specialized illegal morgue or research facility, perhaps storing evidence, perhaps something worse. As the flame devoured the substance, the shrieking diminished into a final, wet hiss. The smoke poured out the front door in a thick black curtain, drawing the real emergency services, the fire department, who were now pulling up behind the police cars already arriving for Henderson. I backed slowly out of the shop, my torch still blazing, until I stood on the pavement beside the now fully conscious, pale as death Mr. Henderson, who was being questioned by a bewildered police officer. I dropped the torch onto the sidewalk, it burned out a second later, and walked calmly over to David, who had just pulled up, briefcase in hand, looking furious that he'd missed the drama. "David," I said, handing him the signed purchase agreement. "The deed to 412 Elm Street now officially mine. The building is secure. It's being cleared by the fire department. I want every square inch of that property, including the sub-basement they're about to discover, professionally sterilized and then gutted down to the foundation." I glanced back at Henderson, who was now being helped to his feet, his eyes avoiding mine completely. He understood. He hadn't just lost his shop, he had lost his secret. "And David," I added, looking at the rising smoke billowing from the roof vents of the gilded nook, "cancel the order for the 3-inch galvanized screws. I think I'll rebrand. Maybe something simpler. The new foundation, perhaps. I have a lot of clearing out to do before I start stocking the shelves."